Good afternoon and welcome to the last session of the conference. I hope you've all had as productive, engaging, and inspiring last 3 days as I have had. And this afternoon, how's the sound? Good. Perfect. Thank you. This afternoon, we're going to discuss managing the risks of nature-based solutions. I'm here today with my esteemed colleagues from several different sectors here, and they're going to provide insight and context on the topics that we'll be discussing. And let's start by having you introduce yourselves, starting with Dr. Griscom.
Bronson Griscom, a tropical forest ecologist by training long ago. And I guess over the past 15 years, I've been working on the interaction between ecosystems and climate. So I guess that makes me a forest ecosystem climate scientist of some sort. And the work I do, it really ranges kind of a sort of split personality. I work on with my team and various other sort of scientists and practitioners, both global science of looking at the suite of options for improving land stewardship and delivering climate mitigation, whether that's avoided emissions or enhanced removals. And then I also work on designing and improving MRV systems as they interact with the design of projects to deliver those things. So focusing in on some of these so-called natural climate solutions, and then working with our country programs at Conservation International to deliver them.
Yes, I'm Christina McCain. I want to thank Lisa for being here moderating this panel, which has been really interesting just to meet you all and talk, and also to NACW for the invitation to be here with you here today. So I'm the founder and principal of Ecosophy, LLC, which is a consulting practice that's focused on climate and sustainability that works with nonprofits, academic institutions, governments, and the private sector. Bronson stole my line. I'm formally trained as a tropical forest ecologist, and I did my PhD research in the Brazilian Amazon. And that experience led me to invest the better part of the last 20 years focused on policy that would reduce the rate at which we are losing forests globally, as well as using market-based mechanisms as a tool to avert what can only be described as a very disastrous climate path. So I've worked in the federal government. I've spent well over a decade in the nonprofit sector, including on these issues, focused on forests and climate, including in philanthropy, and now as an independent consultant. And my goal is to work to serve this whole field for the better. So thanks.
And I'm Kyler Sherry. I'm the COO at the Climate Trust. I've been at the Climate Trust for about 6 years. We're a nonprofit project developer, and we've funded $85 million to carbon offset projects since 1997. Our focus now is on reforestation, improved forest management, and avoided conversion of grassland projects. And my role at TCT is I really bridge the gap between buyers and landowners and coming up with deals that can work for both landowners over all the crediting periods, so 40 to 50-year projects, and then connecting them with buyers and mitigating the different concerns that each party has, and as the communicator. My background is in process-based modeling of greenhouse gas emissions from agricultural sectors. Some of you might know DACENT, I apologize, but that's what I worked on before the TCT.
All right, thank you. And I am Lisa Gonzales-Kramer, your moderator today. I am a registered professional forester in the state of California. I'm the Senior Director of Forest Carbon Development at Mast Reforestation. Mast is a developer of forest carbon projects. We're a vertically integrated reforestation company working on post-wildfire landscapes across the Intermountain West. So we do everything from seed collection, seedling production, planting, and using private financing to provide zero-cost reforestation for landowners, and we market high-quality carbon credits. So let's talk about the reality of nature-based solutions, and that's really what we're providing at Mast, and all of us are engaged in one way or another. And NBS projects are complex, and they carry inherent risks, and yet they're vital for holding global temperature increases to less than 1.5 degrees Celsius. Natural ecosystems, including forests, grasslands, wetlands, and oceans, have the capacity to sequester collectively 50% of global carbon dioxide emissions annually. So while it's not possible to eliminate all risks associated with NBS projects, it is essential to identify, assess, and manage risks effectively to enhance project resilience and maximize positive outcomes. So today we're going to discuss the risks and potential management strategies for NBS. We'll have 2 rounds of questions for the panelists, and between each round we'll stop for questions from the audience, and then of course we'll have additional questions afterward if that is warranted. So Bronson, let's start with you. How do we differentiate between myths and real problems in nature-based solutions, particularly concerning issues of permanence and additionality?
Thank you, Lisa. And echoing thanks for the opportunity to be on this panel. Okay, so I love myth busting because I get to characterize the alternative argument in a simple kind of dumb way and then make myself sound intelligent. So I'm gonna lean in here to the myth busting. So I would start with kind of a framing point that I've heard, I guess just in sort of broader communications about ecosystem-based or nature-based climate mitigation, the notion that it is a side dish, so I'll call it the side dish myth, that it's kind of an optional side dish to a main course of a variety of other sectors that are more kind of industrial, transportation, et cetera. So the latest IPCC report put an end to that myth, if it really was one, or misunderstanding. They review, so this is, IPCC, essentially the biggest effort we have to arrive at global consensus on the climate science. And across, I think it was 7 sectors that they looked at. They identified what they call AFLU, agriculture, forestry, and other land uses, which is basically the topic here. It is the largest. It is the largest climate mitigation potential sector. Energy is a close second, and transportation is somewhere further down. So it's not a side dish. It's a very big mitigation sector, and and they went through cost-constrained options. So we're talking about the cost-effective potential. Now, I think related to this is what I call the either-or fallacy. So often, like, land-based or ecosystem-based climate mitigation is put up against, like, well, we can't, do this because it'll distract us from that. And it's sort of an either-or debate that we sometimes get into. And I think increasingly we're all becoming aware, so this is maybe not a myth, that maybe 20 years ago we could sort of pick and choose. We don't have that opportunity anymore. We have to do fossil fuel emission reductions. We've got to do, improved land stewardship, climate mitigation solutions. All of these things have to happen. But it is rational to start with a lower cost. So I think emissions trading systems that allow us to distribute essentially funds in ways that are cost effective and allow us to deliver across all sectors, but deliver the lower cost options across those sectors makes sense. Okay, so another one, you mentioned permanence. And this kind of gets at the first one. It's kind of like, well, it might be large, but is it serious? Is it comparable? And I think there's, again, I'm oversimplifying the counter argument, but I think there's a myth that anything that's not sort of durability or permanence above 100 years is sort of not taken that seriously, at least in some sectors. And we all know that longer durability is better for sure. But having said that, every decade matters, right? So every decade of storage of imagine like a removal or an avoided emission of a storage of that carbon out of the atmosphere is very valuable. In fact, sooner is also better. So longer durability is better, but storing it now rather than later is better, simply because, well, there's the discount rate of money, which is just a basic economic thing, but but there's a bottleneck we're going through, right? And getting through this period of limiting overshoot and before mid-century is crucial, and we don't want to trigger other sort of problematic outcomes that we can't reverse from. So I think that, to me, that there's a bit of a permanence myth out there. The final myth I'll just mention is what I call a greenwashing myth, the notion that there's sort of bad corporations that are buying green credits in order to avoid trying to hide sort of bad actions. Now, this is not my space. This is more of a kind of corporate action review kind of space that is not my specialty, but there was an Ecosophy marketplace report that came out recently that identified the opposite, that the corporations that are the majority of the corporations that are buying these sort of green credit offsets, most of them are actually at the head of the pack, right? They're actually doing more to clean up their own footprint, to reduce their own emissions, and they're doing that as kind of an additional step, not sort of, to avoid or to sort of greenwash what are bad actions. The last thing I will just say is that additionality, you mentioned additionality, is not a myth, I would argue. There's something that land-based climate mitigation has a particular challenge for us in accounting, which is that the vast majority, about 95% of all carbon fluxes in and out of the atmosphere are actually from ecosystems. So what that means is we can't just start crediting and that's baked into the baseline, right? We can't credit sort of the fluxes of nature without paying attention to what are the actual changes in behavior that are going to bend the curve, right? Because that's, in order to bend the curve, we have to talk about additionality. So I do think, and I think we're going to get more to this and some more further down, that the question of additionality is something we have to pay a lot of attention to, and we have to solve for and make sure we have robust accounting systems around that.
Yeah, thank you. Christina, we're going to address some of your insights as well. How are risks mitigated in NBS standards, particularly concerning uncertainty for both buyers and sellers of carbon credits, and what measures are in place to address those risks?
So thank you very much for the question, where you got it. I think I want to say first that it's really important to understand when we talk about risks and integrity in nature-based solutions and carbon crediting from nature-based solutions, there are two really important major components of integrity and risk, and those have to do with the environmental integrity, which has greenhouse gas accounting integrity incorporated into it, as well as other aspects of environmental integrity, such as biodiversity. And then the social integrity side, which has to do with what are the benefits on the ground, what is the involvement on the ground, particularly when we're talking about community-owned lands or work that's undertaken in the global south, right, where a lot of carbon is concentrated in those tropical forests. And it's important to understand that both of those aspects have been being discussed and are known territory that's been discussed in policy around the relationship between nature and climate for many, many years. They are incorporated into the discussions that have gone on at the UNFCCC over REDD+ at national levels, to the project level voluntary market standards, some of the first ones of which were traded, I think, in the early 90s, to more recent voluntary market standards at the jurisdictional level. Within that, any standard out there that is worth its salt is going to address both of these components. And the majority of the credits that are traded out there with those under those standards that you recognize do address both of these components. And different standards focus on different components of that quality, on the environmental and on the social side, and there are different approaches to those, so I think it's important to be familiar with that. But at a basic level, they should be in there. So focusing on the greenhouse gas accounting and the risks to credits, the primary thing, as Bronson already alluded to, major components of that being the additionality is your intervention, whether it's removal or avoided loss of forest or the ecosystem that you're working in, or whether it's removals, is that something that would have occurred without your intervention, or did your project, your program, your policy drive that change? And so this is about what is business as usual, and did you change business as usual, which is clearly critical to particularly anybody who wants to get credit for a ton as a ton in an offset context. And that is very important, as Bronson said. What is your estimation of what business as usual is? What measurements do you use? What assumptions do you use to arrive at that? And that might be different in different contexts and at different scales be appropriate. But it is really important to understand how the standard that you're looking at, the methodologies that are being used, the project that is being implemented, the policy, is calculating that additionality. Why? Because if your baseline is inadequately conservative or overly generous in the number of credits allocated, then that is a risk, right? Potentially, it's a risk to the atmosphere. It's a risk potentially reputationally if the credits that you are counting essentially don't represent a real change in removals or avoided emissions to the atmosphere. So a really important point, and I think I won't provide, one of the things that makes this actually difficult for me as an independent consultant is I don't have a particular organizational decision on what exactly that should look like, right? But I will say that credibility and high quality of data is really important, and it is important to dig in and understand a little bit about what those assumptions have been to mitigate that risk on additionality. And it's tough, as Bronson said. The other thing is on permanence. How long did you keep the carbon in question out of the atmosphere, or how permanently did you remove it from the atmosphere? And so I think reversal risk is something that, there are ways to estimate what that is locally, but there are always, nature is variable, nature is unexpected. And so there essentially is discounting involved in the standards that are applied of what is the reversal risk in this particular context, and that is something that would discount from the credits that are essentially accumulated or credited to that project. So it's baked into the standard. Buffer pools, a savings account of credits, and the size of that savings account, or how much you have to draw off of your crediting to place in that savings account in case there is a reversal for credits that have already been issued, is another mechanism to guard against that kind of risk. And then I want to say that scale is another important, I'll save this maybe for another point, but scale is another important way of managing that risk, both for the additionality as well as the permanence, and a third component called leakage. If you're talking about a very localized scale, did your intervention matter there? Yes. Did that get reversed somewhere else outside of your project area? Potentially, that's what's known as leakage. And the greater the scale that you are measuring on, at least measuring, even if your intervention is not at that scale, the greater idea that you have about what that risk is or if it's occurred. And there is also discounting that's baked in for that kind of risk. So I just want to make the point that there are risks, but they are very well known, broadly, and it's just important to examine and think about the way that those risks are accounted for in the particular type of credit that you are interested in producing, right, or purchasing. And I'll leave it at that for now. So.
Yeah, and I'm really glad that you did continue on the scale issue of that, because that's really critical to the conversation. Thank you. Kyler, let's move on to you. How can buyers adapt their purchasing agreements to account for the dynamic nature of NBS projects to mitigate risks associated with variability in project outcomes and timelines?
Thank you.
Yeah.
So one thing that I notice at the Climate Trust when I'm working with different buyers on nature-based solutions is lots of times the landowner who's encumbering their land and agreeing to do this project, 40 to 150 year monitoring period gets lost. And I think where that gets lost is when we're talking about deals with buyers, they want to benefit themselves first to make sure that they're protected and they're hitting their climate action goals, which is definitely important, without realizing the risks that the landowner is taking on, both in them starting the carbon project and then these sales agreements that they're entering into, particularly forward sales. So I think that this is really important where buyer education comes in. And so one thing that we, as developers should really promote is the fact that nature-based solutions are inherently important, but they also work in different cycles than some industrial type projects. For example, an industrial type project like dairy, methane, landfill gas projects, there are daily monitoring of those offsets emissions reductions, and so you can pick up if something wrong is happening at the project that day to mitigate risk of having lower offset volumes come from the project. While with nature-based solutions, they work on larger cycles. So for example, if a forestry project starts and then a couple years later you have a few drought years and your forest doesn't grow at the rate you thought it did, you don't pick that up in your modeling until you go out and re-inventory. So you would be selling credits to a buyer during that period of time that then result in less offsets being issued in year 5 or 6, and that cycle goes on for 5 years. Every 5 years you go through that. So because of that cycle, that can be also caused by disease, it's important for buyers to be more flexible when purchasing offsets from nature-based solutions. So a way to mitigate that risk would be to have unit contingent deliveries in more nature-based sale projects, and also delivery deadline flexibility. Flexibility is really key with nature-based solutions. And the reason why flexibility is so important is because if a buyer doesn't receive offsets, lots of times in contracts, the landowner and the project developer have to go find replacement credits for the buyer so that they can hit their climate action goal for that year and offset their emissions. And many times, finding replacement credits on the spot market results in you having to purchase credits at a higher price than you were even contracted initially to supply to the buyer. So it's really important to protect the landowners who are entering into these agreements from that risk, and also the project developers to ensure that they're receiving the carbon revenue. One way I think it's really important because that's obviously a risk for buyers too, is for buyers to have a diverse portfolio. So having those landfill gas projects that you have more insurance of volume, but then also purchasing credits from a wider portfolio of nature-based solutions, so that there is a drought in Alaska and that forestry project doesn't create as many offsets as you expected. Hopefully you have offsets coming in from another project, so that can help mitigate the risk. That does result in more due diligence for the buyer, but I think due diligence is really important for them understanding what they're investing in when they're purchasing offsets from these projects.
Thank you, that's great. Do any of the panelists have further comments from each other's contribution? Okay. All right, I did have something I wanted to bring out, Christina. You had talked about trust in your developer and kind of vetting the developer of the credits in the first place. Do you want to comment a little bit about that?
I guess I would just say, not necessarily even the developer, but the more insight you have on your partners as well, and the more insight you have into what's going on the ground, I think is very important. What is the relationship of the developer with the partners and on the ground, which can be harder to assess when it's something that's far away or in a country, in a context that you're not familiar with. Recognize that's a challenge, but I think it's important due diligence. And then one of the parts of I didn't get to was talking about the social, integrity and benefits on the ground. That also is something that's not only addresses, you having transparency and insight into how this is being implemented, and how risks are being mitigated, but I think it's a really critical contribution to success overall in the end, is to know who the partners are and to know their relationships. Particularly people are a critical component of, it's people that are bringing down forests, right, for various reasons. And to also understand that that's an important component of mitigating reputational risk as well.
I have to say, I want to just interject my own comment here. So as a developer, I personally lead a team of foresters, GIS analysts, biometricians, project managers. When we have a buyer interested in coming to see a project, it is like, it's the best thing. It's a way to really be transparent about what's happening out on the site. It's a way to develop the relationship with the buyer and the landowner, to let everybody have greater transparency about what exactly is that carbon credit doing? What exactly is that purchase providing out on the land? And that connection with where your money's going and what effectiveness it has in the bigger picture is something that solidifies a whole lot of relationships and understanding. And so I would highly encourage buyers to get out there and really take a look and be involved in that process, because it's really, really phenomenal. So with that, any questions from the audience? Thoughts, comments? Yes, we have someone in the back corner.
Okay, hi. Thanks. My name's Leslie Bolick. I worked in RED about 15, 12 years ago. And I guess I really appreciate that on-the-ground knowledge, not just for the tropical forest data, but also, like you were saying, the community and the people data, what's actually happening, what are the behaviors on the ground. I have not been at this conference for about 10 years, and I'm coming back in and seeing all these ratings agencies and this part of the ecosystem. What are your thoughts on the ability of ratings agencies to do due diligence with just the publicly available data or the data they get from project developers without knowing really what's happening on the ground? How are they able, or are they able to really establish additionality?
I mean, that's a very tough question, and I think that, I mean, the topics of ratings and how they're done is newer in this space and how they're undertaken. I was in the panel this afternoon on ratings, and there was a discussion about how those agencies actually, how those organizations actually communicate with the project developers, how they maybe follow up to ask further questions or to validate some of the public, validate is probably the wrong word, that's a very specific definition, but validate some of the information that's publicly available. And I think it's an evolving space. I mean, one of the panelists today basically said, we've just kind of revised our publicly available data policy because sometimes there are insights that come from the project developer that are not public for a particular reason, which might be, very, very justifiable. So I guess that's to be determined, and like I said, an evolving space. But certainly more information I can see as being very useful. Also, when it comes to project level, I think it's really important to be informed about the context. And also, what is the history of that project in that region? And then what is the national, political, environmental policy context, right? I spent a long time focusing on jurisdictional, what should jurisdictional level policies to implement RED at national or subnational scale look like? And even if you're looking at a project level, I think it's really important to also understand as much information as you can about what's going on in that jurisdiction that's going to contribute to the integrity of the project, the success of the project, right? I mean, those ideally should be mutually reinforcing things, what the jurisdiction is doing and what the projects are also accomplishing. So I think that's another potential insight, but it's not to say that great projects couldn't occur in jurisdictions that don't have the best policies in place. Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay. Well, let's go ahead and move on to the next round. Bronson, I'd like you to comment a little bit on, the complexity of establishing additionality in NBS projects. So how can we enhance the credibility and understanding of accounting methodologies to ensure the effectiveness of emissions trading systems while avoiding the perception of greenwashing?
So, I mean, this question caused me to sort of want to step back a moment and kind of think about the magnitude of what we're trying to accomplish. It actually, I think it relates a little bit, I think, to what you were saying, Kyler, earlier, is that we have a more intimate relationship with the industrial and energy systems that we ourselves create. Obviously, we interact in many direct ways, and we sort of create land use and all these things, but it's this kind of dance with ecosystems. And so the task of just the sheer challenge of what we're trying to accomplish, I think it's worth sort of taking a moment to step back and think, we are trying to align and account for the flows of our global backbone, the molecular backbone of life on Earth, right, which is carbon. We're trying to track and account for that and align that with the global, essentially, flows of the backbone of our economy, which is currency, right, whether it's the dollar or the yen or whatever. So we are doing an incredible, this is a monumental thing that we're trying to accomplish. And I feel like when I think back to 20 years in this space, it's like every 5 years we're like, oh, we tried and it didn't quite work. And then we're like, oh, God, we tried again and it didn't quite work. It's like, no, this will take time. But what we have done, what we have accomplished in the past 20 years is incredible. I mean, it's a huge foundation that we're on, and I think the fundamentals and the foundation of both the voluntary standards like Vera, some of the, I guess, emerging meta standards like ICVCM. I mean, these are all key sort of foundations, and that I think, from having just been in that space, sort of writing some of those methodologies and working with those people in that world, I think they're strong foundations, but we have to keep refining and improving the structures on that foundation. So I guess it's sort of a plea for recognizing in our sort of tendency we go through these boom and bust cycles in this space, that this is going to take some time, but we've come a huge way, and I actually think we're closer to solving for a lot of the angst that are out there about accounting than we might realize. I think in the next couple of years we're actually solving a lot. So I'll just give one very simple example is that we're rapidly integrating dynamic baselines into accounting methodologies, which was one of the criticisms that we heard a couple of years ago. Was like, oh my gosh, they're not dynamic in accounting. It's like, okay, now we're revising those methodologies to do that. Okay, so that's kind of one point. Another point is back to this question about the boom and bust cycle. It's like in this space, it's really sort of the importance of steady investment. And I guess steady and smart investment on the demand side. So I guess I'm on the supply side of this game. So I would offer, certainly I guess I have a conflict of interest in this statement, but I would offer that bus cycles are an investment opportunity because the fundamentals, right? The fundamentals of we've already talked about a little bit, the sheer magnitude of the opportunity. It is the most underinvested sector. It is the largest sector and the most underinvested sector out there. As we continue to hone and improve these methodologies, and by the way, when we do that, I should just, as an aside, there's this dance we always have between, we don't want to make it so freaking complicated that it kind of, you yoke the thing with a huge amount of cost and kind of, and sort of MRV, friction, but you also want it to be really robust. So I think all that progress I'm talking about is narrowing both at once, right? We need to be faster and more efficient and more robust. And I think, again, that is sort of, that has been happening, but we've got to keep after it, right? We've got to keep after that process. Okay, so bus cycles are an investment opportunity. Scale, Christina, I just want to second your point. I think part of that kind of need for steady investment is as whether it's corporations or public entities build larger portfolios. That's the size of the portfolio, especially if it's a distributed portfolio trying out different types of natural climate solutions in different places. That actually solves for a lot of those risks. Not entirely, right? We need the accounting methodologies to improve as well, but that helps solve for those risks just by continuing to go after it. Final point, hire forest ecologists. I do think that part of the boom and bust cycle, just a little part maybe, is that in the investor space, the demand side space, the sort of the vagaries, I think you call the curveballs of nature, like they seem existential. They're like, oh my gosh, all the forests are burning down. Like, okay, I guess this isn't a thing anymore. And so, just having, I think, and we see this happening, which is actually very exciting. What we see is the discipline of essentially ecologists, social scientists that work in ecosystems and in the rural communities that manage these ecosystems, kind of coming into the world of corporations and the public sector where these decisions are being made, and help to basically, if a news article comes out, to say, oh yeah, like there's an interesting tidbit in there, and then there's some clickbait that like people shouldn't freak out about.
Yeah.
My thoughts.
That's great, thank you. There is this point that you made regarding as we increase the complexity and the hurdles for the landowner or developer, it also increases costs and has a type of braking effect on actually increasing the rate at which we're developing projects. And that kind of leads into Kyler's next question here. So let's look at how buyers are influencing the development of standards to address the challenge of evolving additionality definitions, especially considering changing land use pressures and market dynamics. And then a part two question is what should buyers consider when evaluating additionality over the long term and the opportunity cost for landowners who are engaging in these projects?
Thanks.
Sure.
Yeah, so buyers, and specifically in recent years, have been really the ones to start driving the market and the updates to standards and protocols that we're seeing, and even some of the rating agencies are in response to buyers, and then also ICBCM and core carbon principles. Because now that buyers are more sophisticated and more engaged, it's really important that we don't just listen to the buyers when making these updates to these protocols, and we listen to all stakeholders involved, including project developers and the landowners and registries. And that's why we have the really important public comment periods on protocols as they're getting updated. One big driver that you touched on before that buyers have really brought to the market is this idea of dynamic baselines for additionality. And additionality, in probably just the last 5 years alone, has changed from what could you do to what would you do. And that's when we're looking at NPV and then coming up with terms of what would be reasonable, feasible, and really figuring out how to define that, which is difficult across all nature-based solutions in all different areas. Obviously, it's way different, in Central America than a project that you have in the United States, the factors going into that. So because of dynamic baseline, we're entering into more conservative baselines, which is really great, and responding to the market. And conservative doesn't necessarily mean less or more offsets. It's just how you establish the baseline. Buyers, I think it's really important, back to the education of buyers, to understand what dynamic baselines, for example, will lead to on projects. It certainly leads to more uncertainty over forecasted volumes and then forecasted revenues for landowners and also project developers who are deciding to do these projects. And this kind of gets back to my first point that I made in the last question, that because of dynamic baseline modeling, I think flexibility is going to need to be even more important. Lots of landowners and project developers need to look for an anchor buyer to help support the project, to know you will get a certain amount of revenues. But with dynamic baseline modeling, you might not end up with the offsets that you projected initially. To the point about the opportunity costs for landowners and thinking about additionality, Landowners are not electing to do a project every year. They make their decision at one point in time to encumber their land for 40 to over 100 years at that point, and the markets then. So I think it's really important that when buyers are evaluating projects, that they're really looking at when this landowner decided to do the project, what did they give up on? So for example, with forestry projects, if timber markets go in cycles, so if timber prices go up, they no longer get to access that by going after higher prices, and the same when they go down. And with dynamic baseline modeling, it's more on the other side where they will have changes in the offset volumes, and I think that gets missed sometimes, is thinking about the timber revenue. So in terms of additionality, lots of times with smaller landowners, so family ranches, family forests that are lower in acreage, they're looking at, when they go into a project, giving up timber revenue for carbon revenue. And it's really important for, I think, buyers to understand how changes in the protocol will affect that decision. So for example, it's going to become more difficult to get landowners to engage when they can see how much revenue they're going to give up on the timber side, but not necessarily know the carbon side because of dynamic baselines. Not saying that that's not important, but it's something that we really have to think about when communicating these changes that are happening to these protocols. So lastly, on that point, I think as buyers are driving changes in the market, there comes extra cost for project developers. So now if you have to verify every year, redo modeling, it's a lot more expensive than it was. So I just really hope that to mitigate the potential for there being less smaller forestry projects or grassland projects because of these changes, buyers will hopefully pay a higher price to help overcome these costs so that smaller landowners and smaller projects are still able to continue to do these projects.
All right, thank you. Thanks. You mentioned the landowner makes a decision once for a timeline of 40 to 100 years or more. And I want to talk a little bit, Christina, if you would, talk a little bit about considering the permanent side of things. So how does the ecosystem level approach mitigate risks associated with factors like wildfire or pest outbreaks? And what role does due diligence play in ensuring the quality and integrity of NBS projects, including social standards and transparency?
Thanks very much, Lisa. And those are two fairly different components. I'm going to address the first one, the permanence issue and the ecosystem approach first, which I think is such an important point. I've sort of already alluded to that with the discussion about scale, right? With scale, you have more data, more things going on, and you're sort of spreading risk, right, across a larger scale. And similarly, I think it may seem obvious to many in this room, but I think that there is a conception out there, a misunderstanding out there, that that this permanence issue. We can imagine forest fires. We can imagine pest outbreaks, and it's important to recognize that those things actually are a normal part of ecosystem dynamics and flux. And we're not talking about crediting a single tree. Purchasing an NBS, forest credit is not adopting a tree, and like if your tree dies, that's it, right? These are dynamic ecosystems, and if we are implementing interventions to conserve and sustainably use those ecosystems over time, they will be sequestering carbon. When you have, maybe in 1 year or another, you have, obviously there could be a catastrophic wildfire, and if it consumes your entire small project area, that is a problem. So I think it's thinking about the ecosystem scale, as in this is, there is a natural cycle that's going to regenerate if the practices are put into place, and that we have that commitment for the long term in that ecosystem. And then there's also a longer time scale that we want to think about, that, what is it that we're going for here in terms of the return of carbon on our investment, and it's really important to think about it that way. I I also hope that Bronson will make that point about the short-term investment and the equivalency of, lots more short-term. Yeah, exactly. Please do. So that, it's important to keep that, that in mind, is that, we like to think that fires are bad and pest outbreaks are bad, and we can imagine that if, I'm imagining a forest and someone comes and cuts it down, but if we are talking about scale, if we're talking about whole ecosystems, and we're doing the right things, this is going to work. And again, diversifying the investment, investing at scale, all mitigates against that. And then I also just wanted to say, on the due diligence point, which we've all made that point, I think it's really critical to understand those different components of quality. And then also when it comes to, what's your concern about the additionality? What's your concern about the permanence? And then what is it that you're investing in that credit for? Like when it comes to dynamic baselines, right? That provides a lot less certainty for the community or the landowner, right? Or the project developer or the partners that are developing that project. And I think it's really important to recognize that there are other reasons to invest in these credits as well, and it really depends on what is your end use and your end goal for that investment. If it is as an offset credit, or it's a net zero claim, that's, you want to count ton for ton, then those things are really critical, but they can make that economic proposition untenable for the providers of that offset. And it's really important to understand that you need to have benefits on the ground, and that those benefits on the ground are also worth something, right? The co-benefits are worth something, not only in terms of the project success, but also in terms of the good that you are doing in this world. It may not return tons of carbon credits immediately, but if that's not your goal in your investment, then price premiums for those, for those types of credits that have an incredible investment on the social side is really important. And that's where, again, it's just important to know what it is that you're buying, but also to be clear from the outset what it is that you're buying for.
Bronson, you had a follow-up.
Oh, yeah, okay, so a follow-up was just to say, I feel like I'm now coming off as like anti-media here, but I'm just gonna say I love the media. But there is a false balance in media, right? So you can put on the front page of a newspaper a picture of a forest fire, and it makes a great, and this is really happening, right? There are massive forest fires, these are unprecedented scales, there's nothing false about that. But what you cannot sell is an article talking about the incremental increase in the growth rate of trees due to global carbon fertilization in the air. But that latter thing is bigger. So one of the amazing things that is not often talked about is that 50% of all of our anthropogenic emissions are getting mopped up by ecosystems right now. The response of global ecosystems to carbon pollution and climate change itself has been not negative, not a sort of collapse of ecosystems, it's been actually an enhanced growth and a net removal by ecosystems, which is kind of amazing. It's kind of crazy. There's a dark side to that, which is that sort of subsidy from nature, there's evidence that it's saturating, right? So we can't count on that just continuing to mop up half of all of our carbon pollution every year. And so there are risks that we will, and this is very hard to predict, this is very uncertain, but there are risks that there will be saturation and then even potentially reversals of that net removal response of ecosystems. So what does that mean? So that kind of puts us in a bind. Mm-hmm. And what I would say to you is it's a double or nothing bet. Ecosystems hold 4 times more carbon than the atmosphere. If we ignore them, and they start to saturate and even start to potentially reverse to net emissions, we're in big trouble, right? We cannot handle a significant emissions from global ecosystems, because that will, 20% emissions from ecosystems would be a doubling of carbon in the atmosphere, right? That would be catastrophic. On the other hand, if we invest in restoration, conservation, better management, that can deliver 30% of the cost-effective solution to climate change and stabilize the problem itself of putting in threat those ecosystems. So that risk, to me, is a reason to invest.
Very true. Any other comments from the panelists? You good? All right. Questions? Anyone from the audience? Sure. Go ahead.
Thanks, Josh Butler, ExxonMobil. When we talk about reversal risk specifically, because there are many types of project-related risks, there's buffer pools, obviously, that we could pull on in the event of a reversal. How much so are they enough from a buyer's perspective as an insurance mechanism? Or, what does the panel think about including actual insurance mechanisms in addition to buffer pools to kind of add a sense of security and also manage risk of a project?
I think this should be raised at an insurance conference, for sure. I'll just say to the buffer pool question, is it enough? Depends on how much you're putting in the buffer pool and the context, right? So the reversal risk should influence the buffer, the buffer pool decision. And that's very much in the context of the exact place, the type of intervention, what are the surrounding risks, the scale, jurisdictional scale, project scale, regional scale, national scale. The idea as these guidelines, standards, methodologies are developed is to be relatively conservative in terms of what's put aside in the buffer pool. That said, we're in a global environment that is changing all of the time. I'm not trying to sell insurance, but I do think it's incredibly important that we invest in this solution and invest now. And if there are other mechanisms that give that assurance, that could be beneficial, but.
Jump in first of all, fascinating question. I haven't heard that one before. And as an ecologist, I'm happy to opine about insurance systems. But let me just say this. Again, admitting my ignorance there, but it seems to me that basically a buffer pool is an insurance policy, but in carbon terms. It's just a carbon insurance pool, right? You're pooling resources and then allowing it to sort of be an insurance policy. And so then it gets back to it brings me back to Christina's point of well, what are you interested in? If you're interested in ensuring the risk of not achieving your climate goals, then you do the buffer pool with actually a pool of actual climate benefits that you can use to make good on your reversal. If your goal is to make sure that you don't lose a bunch of money that you invested in that project, then you should, then it should be an actual more traditional insurance policy.
I want to just follow up too to say that I think there's the kind of assurance and conservativeness that comes with basically discounting, just saying, this is how much we're taking off for insurance, for uncertainty. This is how much we're taking off for leakage risk. This is how much we're taking off. And essentially that just kind of, does it vaporize? It's a conservative approach where you're not actually necessarily putting those, the buffer pool is a conservative approach where you're counting exactly how many credits you're setting aside so that you can replace them later. What the accounting is on, let's say, conservative estimates that maybe at the beginning of a project then decrease over time as the for example, like a project that shows success or a jurisdiction that can decrease its uncertainty estimates over time, right? And do they get back any of those credits? do they go in the buffer pool? I wouldn't actually quote a standard to estimate that, but just to say that the buffer pool is like specifically counting those credits, but there are lots of other ways in which you're setting credits aside. And you consider that, you know, a risk mitigation too, because those are not credits that you claimed, right?
Great point. Okay, any other questions? Yes, go ahead. Yes, please.
Thank you. So I come from a pretty large public water agency, and I'm curious about your experiences working with public agencies who are operating, you know, with rate-based and public dollars, and so are just kind of inherently really risk-adverse when it comes to their lands and how to invest in their lands and how to basically contribute to this space. So I'm just curious from your experience if you have any advice or examples of working with large public agencies on developing projects.
With the public agency as a buyer or as a basically project proponent? Okay.
So I, in a former life, worked for California State Parks as a project developer in the San Diego County. The mountains of San Diego County were burned by the Cedar Fire in 2003, and the Cuyamaca Rancho State Park Reforestation project was the first project on public lands, reforestation, using carbon as a mechanism for funding. So yes, I think a couple of ways that we addressed it, and I'd be happy to talk to you afterwards if you'd like, but essentially we developed the project ex post with the U.S. Forest Protocol under the Climate Action Reserve. We had three major funders, including Disney, American Forests, and Poseidon Water. And basically, we did our model based and our agreements based on the projection of total credits, and then the agreement was formed with respect to a percentage of those credits. So while we didn't specifically say, here's exactly what we're going to provide, it was an understanding that, especially on public lands, you're not specifically optimizing for carbon, you're optimizing for a broad array of carbon and co-benefits, and you're responsible to the public for providing those other benefits as well. So it's a balance. And then with that understanding, you're also agreeing with your buyer that it is a percentage of those total projections that will be divided over the course of the 100 years. Sure. Sorry. I think I took up a lot of time on that. So.
I'll just quickly add that I'm just aware of some municipal water sheds that manage the land for the supply of water that have gotten into looking at carbon, essentially, project proponents for carbon sales. Now, the trick there, of course, is you got to, again, be careful about additionality, that, you have to compare yourself to essentially other municipal watershed managers, not anyway, but yes, that certainly has occurred.
I was hoping for a bit more precision around the term dynamic baseline. I think it's a bit like integrity. A lot of people talk about it, but mean different things. To me, it means you're updating the baseline on some sort of regular interval. I read VM45. I don't actually see a specified interval in there for updating it. So, I'm with ACR. We're also looking at, if, how, when you need to update your baseline, and we're trying to decide, is this a dynamic baseline? It's changing, but I'm curious, a real-time baseline recalculation with satellite imagery provides zero financial assurance, so I don't think that's what at least carbon project developers mean, but it might be what the tech sector means. I guess I'm curious what we think it should mean, because I'd like to define the term in a way that is both practical and, we'll say, has integrity.
And can I just mention, we are at 4:01, so understand if people do need to leave. But let's take that offline. We'll make sure that we address it still after everybody else is excused. But please know that I think that it's clear that, you know, we're talking about complex projects, and it is requiring collaboration across many different sectors. And I think this transparent, this open conversation, ongoing learning, all of that is important for us, really understanding and mitigating and managing for those risks. And so I really want to thank you all for being here. I hope the conversation continues. Please join me in thanking our panelists, and thank you all for joining us.